Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and I want to welcome you here tonight. It always gives me pleasure to have Jeremy Rifkin here. We've known each other for 25 years, and I've watched Jeremy's wonderful studies in a variety of different fields. It's hard for me to even say what my favorite topic is because there have been so many, and he's produced such a wealth of wise books. I think The End of Work might be one of my favorites, at least until now. I think the issue of shifting our economy from petroleum-based to other forms of energy is so incredibly important that I'm really glad that Jeremy Rifkin is working on this issue, because anything that Jeremy puts his mind to, he can make it a salient issue nationally. So here's Jeremy.
Good evening, everybody. There are three great crises facing the human family today. Each one of them is historic in nature. Together, they pose one of the great challenges for society as we try to make the bridge into this 21st century. Every single one of these issues is connected to oil. The first, of course, is global warming. The oil connection is obvious. We spent the last 300 years burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Tremendous benefits for at least part of human civilization in the industrialized countries of the North and the West. Now we're paying the bill. All of that spent energy, that carbon dioxide, is now up in the atmosphere, blocking heat from getting off of this planet. Now, I must say, I first wrote about global warming in 1980 in a book called Entropy. But in the last 22 years, this question of global warming has been an abstract issue, a policy issue. It became real this year. I just came back from Europe, where the talk throughout Europe are the floods. Germany, Central Europe, devastating some of our great historic cities. Here in the United States, people became worried for the first time this year with drought. We have record drought. And then we watched TV every night and we saw those forests burning across the entire western range. And now in Southeast Asia, they're following this brown cloud as it moves its way across the continent. 90,000 people dead already from respiratory diseases. They're expecting a 10% drop in yield of agricultural crops and maybe another 200,000 deaths as a result of this cloud. The scientists, they predicted this in the global warming models. They said, look, we're going to have more violent weather patterns, more floods, more drought, more wildfires. We're going to see the ice melt on the poles. We're seeing that. We're going to see water rising. It's happening. They said we're going to see pathogens crossing species boundaries and creating health impacts and health effects. We're seeing all of that. The current models predict that we're going to see something like a 2.5 to 10 degree Fahrenheit change in our temperature over the coming century. If it's the upper range, that is really serious because, as you know, between the last ice age and today, we had only a 9 degree Fahrenheit change. So what are the implications for ecosystems trying to adjust in less than 100 years to a climate change that usually takes 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 10,000 years to really have an impact? In some ways, I think global warming is the dark side of the industrial ledger. We're paying now in this way, we're paying the price, but if future generations look back at this time in history, they're likely to say the only thing they remember about us is the trace in the geological record. If you measure human accomplishments to date in terms of sheer impact, sheer power, you'd actually have to say that global warming is our greatest single accomplishment in terms of sheer impact, even though it's a negative one. We've actually affected the biochemistry of a planet, and we did it in less than a century. Global warming, the oil connection. The second great crisis facing the human family the north-south divide, the haves, the have-nots. Never before in history have so few human beings enjoyed so much of the largesse of this planet, and so many been denied even basic access to water, land, and food. We don't have anything in the anthropological record, anything like this divide. What we forget is that much of the reason for the problem is directly connected to oil. When OPEC placed that oil embargo in the 1970s, oil shot up by 4 times in less than 4 months. The oil prices never came down. So for 30 years, developing countries, third world countries, have been going to world lending institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, desperate for loans so they could pay for oil. They've never been able to catch up to the price of the oil. So today, 83 cents out of every dollar that's borrowed from world lending institutions by third world countries is being used to pay back the old loans. So almost no oil is getting through the pipeline to the people. The statistic that always I keep in mind is this. The 356 wealthiest human beings in the world today, you could put them in this room. Their combined wealth equals the annual income of 40% of humanity. What more do we need to say? So, global warming, the oil connection. The north-south divide, the haves, the have-nots, more and more debt, the oil connection. The third crisis is one that's very immediate in all of our minds right now, and that's the Middle East and the increasing geopolitical tension there. Remember, Osama bin Laden first took out his ire against the West when we positioned our military aircraft on Saudi soil in concert with the royal family. He vowed a jihad. He said we are desecrating the Holy Land. He delivered on 9/11 with the World Trade Center attack and the attack on the Pentagon. Now President Bush is determined to invade Iraq. The ostensible reason, Saddam Hussein may have a weapon of mass destruction, or at least he would like to have a weapon of mass destruction. I have to tell you, I take President Bush at his word. I think that is his primary motivation. But look, I've lived in this town, Washington, for 30 years. There's a sub-theme moving through this town in all the policy circles. Everyone's aware of it. Mr. Bush is an oil man. Mr. Cheney is an oil man. They cannot be unmindful of the following fact. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the entire world after Saudi Arabia. So a secondary impact of invading that country, we, quote, liberate the oil fields, unquote. And then the United States has a new strategic balance of power in the Middle East with the Saudis and with the whole world. Unless we wonder how the United States is going to get the votes in the Security Council, France is going to want, the French companies, oil companies are going to want concessions. The Russian oil companies are going to want concessions. The Italian oil companies are going to want concessions. After we're in there, they're all going to want a part of the action with the future of oil. You don't think they're going to vote with us? Because our military will be there and we will have the position of strength to determine who gets the oil concessions and who doesn't. Global warming, the great divide between the haves and have-nots, more and more debt in the third world, increasing geopolitical tension in the Middle East. Now, the greatest nation in the world invading a country to liberate the oil. If this were all we were contending with, it would be enough for this generation. But now we have something else. The conventional wisdom was that we had about 40 years or so of cheap crude oil left until we reach peak. Now let me explain peak. It's a geological term. Peak is when half your global reserves of oil are used up. Now that doesn't sound bad, just half, but half is the critical point, not when you run out of oil. When you reach peak on that bell curve and half of your reserves are used up, then your prices never go down. Your prices continue to go up, up, up. Well, in the last couple of years, there's been an interesting debate unfolding in the scientific community, not on the public radar screen at all, but about a dozen world-class geologists, some of the best that we have been going back and looking at the numbers again. And now they're saying, well, maybe we got it wrong. The new computer models suggest that global oil could peak in production by the end of this decade. or no later than 2020. For months, I went back and forth with the Cassandras and the optimists. I talked to them all. And I really didn't know who was right. And then it dawned on me one day, what are we talking about? The difference between the Cassandras and the optimists on when oil is going to peak is 20 to 25 years. In the big sweep of geological history, it's irrelevant. Even in the sweep of human history, it's just a moment. So regardless of which side is right, we're entering the sunset years of the fossil fuel era. And what they both agree on, both sides, after we reach global peak on oil production, half the reserves used. Where are the rest of the reserves? 2/3 of them are in the Middle East and in the stands, the two most politically volatile parts of the world. If we think there's a desperation to get oil now, imagine in 5, 6, 10 years from now when China and India, which is 1/3 of the human race, they're going to want more and more oil for their countries too. Everyone's going to be positioned and focused to the Middle East. We're entering the sunset years of a unique moment in history, which began in the coal fields in England, and it's now winding its way down in the oil fields of the Middle East. The era of fossil fuels, the era of the Industrial Revolution, the era of urbanization, the era of the nation state, the era of the bourgeois family, the era of constitutional rights. All of that came side by side with the fossil fuel energy regime. There's only been about 25 or 30 great civilizations in history. Historians disagree as to exactly how many. There are a lot of reasons why great civilizations collapse. But one of the overriding reasons we see over and over is when a civilization depletes its energy regime, its infrastructure is so locked in, it cannot make the transformation into a new energy regime in time. I was just in Rome last week, and it reminded me. Because, of course, Imperial Rome relied heavily on the soil for its energy regime. It kept taxing the soil and taxing the soil to get more and more food out, surplus, so that they could provide not only for the million slaves in Rome, but for the aristocracy and the non-producing class. By the 3rd or 4th century, all the lands around Rome in the Mediterranean and as far north as into Germany, they were depleted. Rome had 1 million people at its height. By the 7th century, 40,000 people living in that city. It collapsed. And the soil base didn't come back, and civilization didn't come back for more than 7 centuries. There is a new energy regime on the horizon. You can almost smell it. You can feel it. It's just there waiting, and it's hydrogen. It doesn't take a prophetic voice to understand this. In science, we talk about decarbonization. And what we begin to understand is that if you look at energy regimes, each energy fuel we have used in the last 400 years has had less carbon than the fuel before it. We went from wood to coal. Wood has more carbon than coal. We went from coal to oil. Oil has less carbon than coal. We went from oil to natural gas. Natural gas has less carbon than oil. At the end of the line, there's one energy left: hydrogen. There's no carbon. It's the most basic, ubiquitous element in the entire universe. It's the stuff of the stars. It's a fuel that when you burn it, only emits pure water and heat. That's the good news. The bad news is, unfortunately, hydrogen does not exist free-floating to any considerable extent here on Earth. You have to extract it from something else, either fossil fuels or water. Most of the commercial hydrogen today is extracted from natural gas. They steam out the hydrogen and then they store it. But natural gas is a carbon-based fuel. And studies suggest that natural gas will peak in production about 10 years after oil. So if we rely on creating an entire global infrastructure to take hydrogen out of fossil fuels like natural gas, we'll be back to square one, right back into an energy crisis, having put all that money into building a new infrastructure. There's another way to do this, a more elegant way to extract the hydrogen. That is, take renewable sources of energy, wind, solar photovoltaic, geothermal, hydro, biomass. Generate electricity locally. Then electrolyze the water with the electricity, just like you did in high school chemistry class. Separate out the hydrogen from the oxygen. Store the hydrogen, then place it in a fuel cell whenever you need it for power, heat, and light. So the first question is, why would you generate electricity twice? This is something, when you leave tonight, this is something you have to take with you. We have a generation that's believed in renewable energy. We've wanted to have these new technologies, wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, biomass. We cannot have a renewable energy society without hydrogen as the storage carrier energy for it. This is what we have to understand. It's not just one of many technologies. Here's what I mean. When we generate electricity with renewables, electricity flows. You can't store it. So if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing and the water isn't flowing over the dam one day, your economy halts. This happened in Brazil last year. It's a hydro economy. They rely on hydroelectric power, which is renewables. Drought, maybe because of the changing global weather patterns. The electricity went out. That economy is still reeling in Brazil from the consequences of that. Hydrogen is a way to store renewable energy. Absolutely the centerpiece of a renewable society. General Electric, General Motors, a lot of big companies, are in the process now of setting up distributions systems to place stationary fuel cells in the market this year. You can already buy one. You take and buy a stationary fuel cell and you place it in your factory or in your office or in your home or in your community center. Then you generate your own content. You generate your own energy and electricity. This is a complete change in the way we've understood power, literally and figuratively, because the whole fossil fuel era has been based on taking power from the top down, centralizing it, and then moving it to the end users. Here, you get a fuel cell, you then connect it up, then you create your own power, your own energy. Then, if you have surplus electricity, sell it back to the main grid. 30 states now in the United States allow us to sell excess electricity back to the main grid. And now there's legislation in the U.S. Congress to open up the whole country. We have to understand how revolutionary this is, this legislation. I just came back from Europe. Country after country now is passing legislation to open up the grid so that end users, especially if they're using renewable energy, can sell their energy, you and I, back to the main power grid. It's potentially a revolution, but we'll get into all the problems that come with it as well as the challenges. Automobiles. The auto companies spent over $2 billion to get to the hydrogen car. Now, I've got to tell you, like many, I was skeptical until this year. I thought, all right, they're playing with hydrogen, they're not serious, they're really trying to avoid having to deal with CAFE standards, increasing fuel efficiency, conservation, the things we need to do to save on fossil fuels and use them appropriately. I suspect that we, the skeptics, were probably right. But you need to know that everything has changed in the last several months. And what changed everything is the state of California. Governor Gray Davis just signed legislation in that state, which will be looked back on it as an historical turning point. If you want to sell an automobile in the state of California in the year 2009, you have to have near zero emissions. That's hydrogen. All right? Now, General Motors and the other auto companies, they're suing the state of California. But I can tell you that behind the scenes, they're desperately in a race with each other to get those cars ready by 2009. You can't give up the California market. It's the biggest automobile market in the entire world. It's not a niche market. On September 26th, you're going to see a car debuted at the Paris Motor Show unlike any car you've ever seen. It's called the Highwire. It's a General Motors car. They built this in 9 months, most of it engineered and designed in Europe, showing us that if they really wanted to do it, they could have done it a long time ago. This car has a chassis, which is a fuel cell power plant. It's about 6 inches thick. It's like a skateboard. The chassis lasts 20 years. You snap on whatever model car you want. You go in this week, you say, I want a convertible, snap it on. This is a working car. If you want a station wagon next week, snap it on. No steering wheel, no brakes, no pedal, no engine. It's all by wire. You have a joystick. It's a dot-com car for the dot-com generation. And the hydrogen, when it burns, gives us only pure water and heat. Now, unfortunately, they're using fossil fuels, like natural gas, to steam out the hydrogen. But it's the beginning of a great transition. When these cars aren't operating, and for most of the day, cars aren't operating, they are power plants. You can plug them into your home, your factory, the shopping mall, the civic center, and you can sell energy back to the power grid. If 25% of the fleet of cars in this country were plugged in at any given time, you could eliminate every single power plant today in America. That's coal-burning plants, oil-burning plants, natural gas plants, nuclear plants. With fuel cells, be they mobile or stationary, we have the possibility, and I put this in quotes, the possibility of bottom-up energy. And that is moving it back to the grid. The problem with these power grids, they're like the communication grids. Remember, the communication grids were totally centralized from a central source to us. And then we began decentralizing with the World Wide Web, at least the communication structure. Here we have the possibility of opening up energy to peer-to-peer sharing. But what it's going to require is the reconfiguration of our power grids. Let me step back for a moment. The great changes in history, and there's only been a few, the great changes in history in terms of how we organize our economic and social existence usually come when two things happen. A revolutionary change in the way people communicate with each other, and then a revolutionary change in the way they harness the energy on the planet. Example, the great cereal civilizations of the Middle East, which began 10,000 years ago with their very complicated hydraulic and irrigation systems. They required a new communication, a new form of language. You couldn't organize the complex density of relationships you needed for hydraulic agriculture with oral communication. Writing became the new command and control mechanism to manage an agricultural civilization. Gutenberg invents the print press. For 2 centuries, it didn't have much of an economic mission. It had a social mission. Mass-producing those Bibles certainly caused a problem for the Vatican and the Pope and played a big role in the Protestant Reformation. But the economic mission of print didn't become clear until James Watt patented that steam engine on the eve of the American Revolution. Print became the language to organize the fast-paced, increased density of coal and steam. When we go to coal and steam, we increase the pace, the speed, the diversity, and the density of human exchange, right? It's faster. We compress time, we overcome space. But it requires a communication between people that's complex enough to organize it. You could not have organized the Industrial Revolution with codex, longhand, in the monastery, on the paper, or with oral culture. It required print. The telegraph and the telephone preceded the internal combustion engine and the electrification of factories. Here's what I'm suggesting. Last 20 years, we've all been watching the unfolding of a new communication revolution. The new software, computers. We've been looking at the development of the World Wide Web, the smart technologies, and the telecommunication revolution. Yes, we connected 1 billion people at the speed of light, no small feat. Yes, we increased productivity at the workplace by 1.5% over the decade. That's impressive. But most of these companies that were formed in the last 10 years, they were toys. These dot-com companies were games because no one really understood the mission of this language, this communication revolution. So these little companies came and went with the bubble and the burst. What is going to become clear in the next year or so is there's going to be a marriage between the communication revolution of the last 20 years and distributed, decentralized hydrogen energy power. In order to move your energy on the grid to who you want, when you want, on your terms, We have to take these new communication technologies, place them on the grid. They're the command and control mechanisms that allow us to move energy where we want, just like quantas of information. You with me here? Once we do this, and we decentralize these power grids with smart technologies, so we can move energy where we want to whomever we want on our terms, this is a deep, deep paradigm shift. And I don't use that term paradigm more than once every 10 or 20 years when I'm in a talk. This is a deep shift. This isn't a killer app for tomorrow morning, as we say in the business community. This is not a quick bubble. This is laying down the long-term infrastructure for an entire new energy regime that's smart, that's based on hydrogen, and that moves peer-to-peer horizontally, not vertically. There are 850 companies rushing now into this hydrogen era, although not much has been talked about in the media. It's about where the personal computer and internet revolution was in the mid-'80s, about to move out of the door. But it's much deeper. It's an infrastructure revolution that will unfold over the first half of this century and be in place by the end of the century. As long-lasting an impact as coal and steam and the laying down of rails and the telegraph. PricewaterhouseCoopers just came out with a study projecting that in 18 years from now, this hydrogen fuel cell revolution will be worth $1.7 trillion. That's in just 18 years. Just the beginning. Now, as many of you know, I have been very critical about technologies, many of the technologies we've introduced in society over the last 30 years, and that's to be charitable. I've also been very critical of corporate power. I want you to listen carefully to what I'm saying here now. We have the possibility of democratized, decentralized energy. It's only a possibility. There's going to be a struggle unfolding over who controls the basic energy on this planet. And this struggle will be as deep as any political struggle we've ever faced. In many ways, the analogy here is the World Wide Web. Early on, a lot of the young people that put the web together said, we're going to have democratized communication. We're going to share peer-to-peer. We're going to bring everyone together in a relationship of reciprocity. Well, they didn't anticipate AOL Time Warner and Microsoft and Universal Vivendi. They said, sure, communicate all you like as long as you pay an access fee. Let us control the portals of cyberspace, then you can talk if you like. Let me say that this struggle is nowhere near over. If you think the struggle around the web is over, I've got news for you. It isn't, because of the nature of the technology itself. Yes, Microsoft's very powerful, but how many of you use yourself Linux, open source code? It's moving very aggressively around the world. Yes, all the big companies want copyrights, but every young person I know has gotten around it and still are with file sharing everything, peer-to-peer, without paying at all. So this struggle's ongoing. What I'm suggesting is when we begin to decentralize our power grid and move to hydrogen and move it peer-to-peer, we're going to have the same struggle. The energy companies, the power and utility companies, they're going to want to control every aspect of this emerging energy revolution. And we need to understand the breadth and scope of this. When we went to coal and steam power, it changed everything. All of our living patterns, all our concepts, all our ways of doing business, all of our concepts of politics and governance. As we move to hydrogen and out of fossil fuels, our living patterns, our social patterns, our economic patterns will change in just as revolutionary a way. We have a 50-year period now, it's 3 generations, to understand the breadth and scope of this. When we went to coal and steam, carefully on the other. The reason I say that, British Petroleum and Dutch Shell have spent 10 years. They're way ahead of us in the environmental community, way ahead of the public. They have made a decision. They know we're entering the end stages of the fossil fuel era. Both CEO Brown at BP and CEO Watts at Dutch Shell have said we're moving to the end of the hydrocarbon era. We're moving into the promise of a hydrogen economy and a hydrogen age. They're buying up renewable technologies. They're patenting the technologies. They have huge hydrogen divisions to store that energy. They're on the move. And so the power and utility companies, They'd like to be able to say, sure, we'll put a fuel cell on your end site at your home, your factory, your business. We won't even lease it to you. We won't sell it to you. We'll put it there because it'll be cheaper for us at the power and utility company to put a fuel cell at your site, your business, your factory, or your home than to build new capacity. And since deregulation has meant we don't have much liquidity, we don't have a lot of cash, this is going to be a lot cheaper for us to decentralize the grid. Don't worry about it. We'll put the fuel cell on all the end sites. All you will have to do is pay a fee for the time you get power, heat, and light. No meter. The end users have to organize. We have to organize so that we can collectively control the energy we produce and then negotiate with these virtual power utility and energy companies. Let them create the software and the hardware. Let them manage the grids. There is room for the entrepreneurial spirit here. We need it. And for the sophisticated know-how. And there's also no problem with making some money. But if we lose control over the energy we produce, we're lost. And here's the analogy. American labor movement, the European labor movement. It became very clear by the late 19th century that individual workers could not negotiate their contract with management alone. They organized collectively into trade unions. It took nearly 70 years and 4 or 5 generations of steadfastness and sacrifice before organized labor could close the deal. In the 1950s, organized labor was at its peak in the industrial countries and was strong enough to force the post-World War II management to share the gains of the Industrial Revolution. The result, everybody's boat was raised. We had unprecedented prosperity in the industrial countries for one generation between our parents, the baby boomers, and their children. We need to have the same kind of organizing fervor here when it comes to controlling the power we generate. We're going to have to look to alternative financial instruments. In Europe, the powerful producer and consumer cooperatives. Here, cooperatives, credit unions, alternative financial institutions in local communities, community development corporations. There are a lot of instruments that we need to bring to bear to create a new social movement. And this new social movement to control the power that we generate has to be as serious and has to be as long-term as the movement for organized labor over the last century. Then we can negotiate what I would call an Aristotelian balanced relationship. Let business create the software and hardware. Let them manage the grids because they're not going to be producing the energy anymore. Let the civil society, the communities control the power and energy. And let government provide the incentives so that we can make the bridge from the fossil fuel age to the hydrogen economy. Win, win, win. The real beneficiaries of hydrogen is the third world. As long as third world countries are desperate for oil, they're going to stay in debt. Now, the young people took to the streets in Seattle and Washington and Genoa and all of these ports of call to protest inhumane conditions in this world, including third world debt. And the banner cry of the activists on the streets, cancel third world debt. Amen. But my friends, that's not enough. If all we do is cancel the debt's going to be back in 12 months. As long as they're trying to get oil, they can't catch up to the price. No way that can be done. So in the developing countries, civil society organizations, NGOs are becoming aware of what their next responsibility is. Get renewable technologies into local communities, wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, biomass. Then electrolyze your water locally. It can be dirty water, fresh water, salt water, pure water. And then create your own microgrids. So you're not dependent on oil coming in each month. You have your own power generated locally. The reason people are powerless is they don't have power, figuratively and literally. All through civilization, those who have controlled energy have controlled the destiny of their society. 65% of all the people in the world tonight, 65% of all the people in the world tonight have never made a single telephone call. 1/3 of all the people in the world tonight have no access to commercial energy or electricity. When you're looking for firewood and for dung for 4 or 5 hours a day just to heat your rice, you're not a player. You're not a player. And all of the protests in the world will not make you a player. In order to become part of the process, people have to control their own energy from the bottom up. Let me say that I think that the last 3 centuries inevitably had to be top-down. It's the nature of the energy regime. It's the thermodynamics of the energy regime. Fossil fuels are hard to, first of all, fossil fuels are hard to locate. They're not found everywhere. That means you need a military apparatus and a political apparatus to secure strategic advantage in those regions of the world where the fossil fuels exist. Fossil fuels are hard to extract, hard to mine, hard to drill. They cost a tremendous amount of capital just to distill them and move them through the arteries of society. So from the get-go, fossil fuels had to be a top-down energy regime. And it had to create a top-down command and control mechanism to manage it. Rockefeller became the first great baron of the 20th century because he understood whoever controls the oil controls the century. The 20th century was all about oil. We grow our foods in petrochemical fertilizers and we use pesticides. Most of our clothes are made out of synthetics from oil. Our power, heat, and light is made from fossil fuels. Our plastics, our building materials, our pharmacological products, fossil fuels. We are totally dependent. And so what we ended up with by the 1950s is 20 or 30 energy companies pretty well controlling the arteries. Now we've got about 10 state-owned companies, and then there are 10 publicly owned companies. And because of the cost of this kind of energy regime, it rewarded economies of scale in business. We went from cottage industry to factory industry because in order to afford steam power, you had to have big investment capital to create big factories. The end of this process is globalization from the top down. And so now we have a few hundred companies running much of the activity of the world because they have access to the oil and the energy that flows through the arteries of society. Never before in history have so few institutions been the ultimate arbiter of so many lives on this planet. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not opposed to the marketplace or business. I teach in a business school. I work with CEOs and business leaders all over the world. I'm in favor of having a commercial part of our life. We all have to trade and exchange. But we need to do it on the basis of reciprocity. When any sector of society becomes too powerful at the expense of the others, then we risk inequities and an unsustainable relationship with our environment. And the losers are the next generation. Globalization from the top down, unfortunately, I think, ended with that tragic collapse of the World Trade Center. It was a horrific act. And let me say at this point, I think that the left community in the world, I was so shocked at the silence of the left community in the world not reacting to the collapse of the World Trade Center and those deaths. This was a crime against humanity. And so if we speak up against crimes against humanity in other parts of the world, we sure should have spoken up with the same anger about the collapse of the World Trade Centers and those innocent lives that were lost. But having said this, this horrific act was a terrible metaphor for the end of the age. Those world trade towers collapsed from the top down. I believe that globalization from the top down is over. And I work with business leaders around the world, and privately, they're worried because for globalization to work, you have to have trust. Because for globalization, you have to exchange. You have to break down barriers and borders. You have to have mobility of populations and labor and goods and services. When you lose social trust, you can't have globalization. Does anyone believe that social trust today is higher than it was a year ago or 2 years ago or 3? No. But we could begin a new chapter. Could begin tonight. We could begin talking about re-globalization from the bottom up. If local communities around the world can control their power and energy, then they can produce locally and sell globally. As long as we are in a fossil fuel regime, top down, third world countries will simply be commodity providers and dumping grounds. But if people can control their own energy, produce locally, sell globally, then we can have real trade and exchange. Now that doesn't mean there isn't room for big companies. You're not going to produce automobiles in every community. There's room for a balanced relationship here. And the model here, interesting enough, is Italy. Of the G7 countries, this is the economic model for the developing world. It's the only one. If you've ever traveled to Italy, you know that from Rome north, they have little teeny production units in each industry. Now, this is the 5th or 6th largest economic power in the whole world. 70 million people. Not bad. Little teeny production units in little towns. They join together in producer cooperatives by industry. They then buy with economies of scale upstream, and they market downstream to the whole world through their cooperatives. And they've been able successfully, with little teeny production units, to cooperate industrially, and they're the 5th or 6th largest economic power in the world. Not too bad. That's the role model here for real development in the third world in the 21st century. Last few thoughts. I think the time frame for this, people ask me, what's the time frame? My time frame on this doesn't differ too much from Dutch Shell and BP and some of the other companies involved. I think what we're going to begin to see is hydrogen used with premium power in factories and businesses is going to really move aggressively in the next few years. It already is. In places like Silicon Valley, they don't trust the power and utility companies anymore. They don't have enough liquidity to build new capacity. So companies are worried that there'll be brownouts and blackouts because the utility companies are cash poor. If you have a 1/8,000th of a second flicker in your electricity at a big factory, your whole production line goes out. So now there's a new term. They call it premium power. They're putting in the fuel cells. They're putting in distributed generation. They're now generating their energy at the end site. And pretty soon, they're beginning to think about this. A few have done it. They go together in industrial parks and share the energy with each other. It's a revolution. We'll begin to see it in home use in the next decade only if two things happen. If oil shoots through the roof and natural gas prices, and your electricity bill really starts to go up because of the increasing geopolitics in the Middle East, people are going to start rushing out to get their fuel cells. I have no doubt about it. You're going to start to see hydrogen cartridges in the next year or two. So you'll be able to use a little cartridge and power up your cell phone for 40 days. Not bad. Or your laptop or your appliances. Automobiles, I would predict to you that we're going to see the first mass-produced hydrogen cars in the showroom before 2009. And once Detroit and the rest of the auto industry moves from the internal combustion engine to hydrogen, that's the beginning of the shift. How serious are they? Governor Engler, who's a Republican, lest you think this may be something the Democrats and the center-left are going to be the champions of, maybe not. Governor Engler is a close friend of President Bush. He made an announcement this spring which everyone ignored. He put together an entire consortium of research institutes, the auto industry, the utility companies, and he set up a Renaissance Park for all of Michigan. Tax rebates, saying every company in the world located in Michigan, we're going to make a great historic transition out of internal combustion and into hydrogen and fuel cells. So the issue in my thought is this. Whether it's Republican or Democrat, what we have to do in our communities is think the way people did when they organized labor. A lot of folks and a lot of institutions that want to control this new regime in history. And unless we have the fortitude and the strength and the resolve, neighborhood to neighborhood, through our co-ops and our community associations, to organize this collectively, we'll be at the beck and call once again of these big companies. And it would be a shame. Hydrogen's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. We now have the technology and a source of energy that could actually democratize and decentralize power for the first time. It could be squandered. It could be used in a way that's top-down, even though it has the promise of bottom-up. Last thought. For the last 3 centuries, the prime motivation of the human race has been to extend political democracy. It really did begin with the American Revolution. So for 3 centuries, there's been this new aspiration in the world. We want to participate on a reciprocal basis, equal representation in the political arena. This has been the defining moment of human aspirations for 3 centuries. And even in the 21st century, democracy continues to try to extend itself. It will come to the Middle East, hopefully with not a lot of bloodshed. It's coming. It will come to China. But here is the problem. We've been living in a contradiction for 3 centuries. because in our political arena, we have aspired to real representation and democracy. Yet our energy regime and the technology infrastructure we created to move it and the economic institutions to process have been top-down, centralized in their command control, and inevitably exploitive. So for 3 centuries, we've desperately tried to extend the notion of representation politically while we've lived in an economic infrastructure that doesn't allow that to really happen. You know that, and I know it. And the way we know it intimately is when we say, gee, our vote doesn't count, because all that money from the corporations determines who gets elected to office. All goes back to the energy regime we've established over the last 3 centuries. As we make this shift to hydrogen, distributive generation, decentralized in every community, you create your own energy, you create your own energy, you share it peer-to-peer, you collectively organize it. Once that happens, we have the possibility, at least, possibility in quotes, of creating a seamless web between participation in our economic life and the kind of democratic participation we want in our political life. If we can begin to create that tapestry, that seamless web between real democratized, decentralized commercial activity and political representation, reglobalization from the bottom up, we've got a chance for a great leap forward in the 21st century. I think the jury is out on this one. It's not about the technology. The technology is going to allow us to do this. It's whether this generation and the next generation and the next generation into the mid part of the 21st century will have the same commitment and resolve and sense of sacrifice as your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had with organized labor. Organize, organize, organize. This is our chance to control the power we generate in this world to make a difference. Reduce global warming. Retire third world debt. Narrow the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Reduce the geopolitical tension in the Middle East. Create an energy regime that's sustainable, that stewards our fellow creatures, that protects the earth, and it leaves our imprint, our legacy, a better world for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think that that was the most optimistic talk I've heard in a long time. It's a very moving. I want to encourage you to use the microphone. I was going to ask a question, but there's already somebody here poised and ready.
You have a very interesting thesis. If you put a hydrogen cell in every home in the third world, how would you prevent the corrupt regimes in the third world from controlling, by controlling the energy grid, simply from taking it over, just as they have done with other parts of the third world economy?
They're going to want to take it over. Look, if you were hearing this talk from someone from industry, you should be skeptical, all right? I've spent 30 years, as you know, along with a lot of you people in this room that I know, fighting these battles. What I'm going to say to you is, sure, the governments will want to control this. The corporations are going to want to control this. The energy companies are going to want to control it. I know that for sure. What I'm suggesting here is that it's going to require a tremendous bottom-up political organization in order to be able to realize a bottom-up energy regime. Now, it's interesting at Johannesburg, at the World Summit, the #1 issue on the table was energy and renewable energy. And the European Union said, we want 15% renewables around the world. And the NGOs there said, we want renewables in our communities. Who fought it? Of course, the United States, countries like Saudi Arabia, but some third world governments. They said they would rather have more debt by continuing to have oil flow than move into an energy regime where their people could control their own energy. So in the first world, big corporations are going to want to control it. In the second world and in the third world. So I think the answer to this is not to be optimistic. I'm not an optimist. Being Jewish, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I think always that you hope for the best and expect the worst. Does that make sense? And at least historically, that seems to have panned out. What I'm saying here is to be an optimist or pessimist is a waste of time, because then you're just reflecting on a future. You're either saying, I hope it'll be here, it'll never happen. If you hope it'll be here and don't do anything about it, it isn't going to happen. So that's an optimist. And if you're a pessimist and don't believe it's ever going to happen, then you won't go out there to do anything to make it happen. What I think we should do is be hopeful and not be naive. And that is be realistic and understand the sacrifice. My biggest concern, if you ask me what the concern is, that our attention span now with each generation is so narrowed in this highly dense, high media civilization we live in, that our attention span is so narrow with each generation that we may not have the reflection and projection necessary politically to hang in there for 3 or 4 generations to make this infrastructure a reality. That's my biggest reservation. I want to be proven wrong. I want every young person out there in the United States and around the world to prove me wrong and to say we will have the fortitude for 3, 4, 5 generations to prepare this revolution.
Jeremy, it seems that in order to have the popular consensus that would be necessary to build a political movement that would be strong enough to negotiate with power companies, you'd have to actually get fuel cells into consumers' homes in a mass way very quickly. I think one of the reasons why we've seen regulation on the internet develop the way we have is because in the initial years where the building blocks that now form the basis of the regulation, there was a much reduced population that was actually on the internet. So you don't want to have a small and elite group with the fuel cells early on, because that's when the regulation is going to be made. So how do you, I mean, it strikes me that you need mass distribution to consumers very early on. Do you have any ideas about where the money for that is going to come from and how you're going to do that?
Let's talk about Europe and the United States. In Europe, the producer and consumer cooperatives are very powerful, very strong. They already have the end users. They already have the membership, and they are a real financial powerhouse. That's the place to start. And I've been having meetings privately for 6 months. I spend 2 weeks every month in Europe. I have been for, it's a long commute, 2 weeks every month for nearly 10 years. I've been meeting with cooperatives in Europe. I think they're the place because they can buy for their membership with economy of scale cheap. Then they can collectively organize with their membership so that the power is controlled, and then they can negotiate with the utility companies to simply manage the grids. Here in this country, it's going to be more difficult. We don't have that cooperative base. Cooperatives are here. They're a force, but they're not as powerful a force as in Europe and Japan and other parts of the world. Here, we'll have to rely on a potpourri of institutions in the community. Community development corporations, they're not very powerful, but they exist. Credit unions, citywide credit unions, are becoming a real player in the United States. And I have given talks now at most of the major credit unions in the last 6 months on this. So we really are beginning to condition them to think about it. There's another point of reference here that may take this up. Common interest developments. Common interest developments, of course, are planned communities where people are members in the planned community. We have 40 million people living in these planned communities now, and at the rate it's going to be more and more and more. It's in their interest, even though it's nonprofit, it's not a nonprofit institution, it's sure in the interest of a community that's planned, that's membership, to buy with economy of scale, control their own fuel cells, and then work a deal with power, utility, and energy companies. But you'd have to have the will and resolve by every single common interest development board of trustees when they meet, and they meet all year round, just like condo associations could do it, to say, hey, we'll control our own fuel cells. Why don't we just buy them here? The co-ops in New York, watch them. They may be the first place where you'll see that. The home co-ops throughout the New York metropolitan area. They represent a lot of families. They can buy and scale, and they're already buying their energy from, I believe, the rural electrical cooperatives, and they're buying it already for their memberships at a discount. So there's a lot of opportunities. Tremendous struggle.
Jeremy, are the fuel cells ready now?
Yeah, you can get fuel cells right now. But there's a lot of cost problems. There's a lot of technical problems, commercial problems. But yes, you could get a fuel cell now. Where you're seeing now is in premium power for industry. You're really not seeing them in homes now. But that could change very, very quickly. Let me say one more thing about the EU and the United States. The European Union is positioned right now to make the leap, because the European Union has targeted that they have to have 22% of all their electricity generated with renewable energy in 8 years from now. Do you hear that? 12% of all the energy in the EU, all of it has to be renewable in 8 years from now. Hydrogen's the centerpiece. What you may begin to see in the folding of the next few months is the European Union beginning to, and they are starting to mobilize the investment community, the business community, the civil society organizations, the governments, and say, look, let's create a long-term roadmap. If the European Union were to say we're going to create a long-term roadmap to become the first hydrogen superpower of the 21st century, do you know the implications here in this country? The only thing, and the older folks can resonate with this, the only analogy I know of here is when the Russians sent up Sputnik. And now, we panicked, and I can tell you, I was 11 years old, and I knew something big was happening because I walked into class that day. The teacher said, put away the art, put away the music, put away the English literature, put away the history, take open your science book, take open the math book. I didn't even like science and math. So what I'm suggesting is we mobilized for 30 years because we were panicked. We lost the technological lead to the Russians. If Europe positions itself, which it is now, it may become the first superpower hydrogen society, decentralized across the continent. That means the U.S. is going to have to rush to catch up. If we don't, we could become a second-rate power by 2025, 2030, 2040.
I think the vision you have is spectacular, and I think you did an exceptional job of articulating it. I'm really impressed the way you weave a lot of things together. A lot of the issues with regard to that have already been raised too, with regard to the
I think you need to speak up.
Speak up even louder?
Yeah.
Okay. The control of the resources, or the parallel process of the greater participation of people in the decisions through the distribution, the decentralization, actually the devolution of power that's taking place worldwide at the same time, there is a concurrence there that and the move to renewables and potentially the fuel cells really reinforces that. I guess what I want to ask though, if either in your book or in your other research you have dealt with the costs, and I don't mean entirely the economic costs, I mean even the energy costs. And by that I'm talking about the amount of energy that goes into, you've already talked about how energy intensive everything we have around us is, the energy that goes into the creation of all the equipment and the backing for the fuel cells, the storage, the hydrides and so forth that have to be put together. The energy then that goes into the hydrolysis of, or the electrolysis of the water, etc., for the separation, so that you end up actually having an economy that requires a lot more energy to go into it than what you get out. I mean, what's been so fabulous about fossil fuels is, in spite of what you said, they needed a large organization to get them started, the return is so tremendous, and renewables don't have that return, and hydrogen doesn't either. That's all. So
no, very important point. Let me go through this if I can. Right now, without producing electricity twice for hydrogen, right now wind is competitive in parts of Europe, the U.S., and elsewhere. Photovoltaic only in some places. Biomass, yes. Geothermal, no. Hydro, yes, where it exists. All right? What you're beginning to see is what we call Moore's Law is setting in here. Moore's Law came out of the software and telecommunication industry, the idea that every 12 months, when you're really into a technology revolution, you're really moving with it, every 12 months your knowledge base doubles and the price goes to half. That's already set in with hydrogen and fuel cells. Industry wouldn't be developing it if they didn't think that it would work. British Petroleum wouldn't have a new moniker, Beyond Oil. How's that for postmodern? British Petroleum Beyond Oil. Huh? That's real postmodern. So what I'm suggesting here is a few things, and I make this point in the book. As oil prices go up, which they will, because we're moving toward peak, they're already $30 a barrel. They may go down slightly if we invade Iraq and in the short run secure the oil fields, but there's no way to get around increasing oil prices because oil is going to peak, whether it's in 10 years like the pessimists say, or whether it's in 30 years, 35 years as the optimists say. As oil and gas go up, you have other costs. You have the cost of securing the oil fields and the gas fields. We now spend, our U.S. government now spends more money in maintaining our military presence in the Middle East than the actual net value of the oil that comes back to us. This is what you begin to see at the end of an energy regime in a great civilization. This happened in Rome. They were spending more money to try and maintain their military and maintain their colonies than the net energy they were getting back through the flow line to the people. That's when you know collapse is setting in. So at some point, your oil and natural gas gets so expensive, the cost of securing it militarily and politically becomes expensive, then the entropy bill, the external costs become more expensive. How much is it going to cost when we have to deal with floods and droughts and fires and seawater rise and pathogens crossing species boundaries? When you calculate up the figures, I can tell you that the figures, if we continue with fossil fuels, will eventually be at least as great as the benefits we got out when we went to the upside of the bell curve for the Industrial Revolution. When the energy was cheap, we didn't have the entropy bill, we had a lot of benefits. When we move down the downside of that bell curve, when we have less oil, less gas, yet the cost of cleaning up from all of the back activities starts to overwhelm it, then you know you're in trouble. Then again, you're spending more energy trying to hold on than energy getting through the flow line. So, the other part of this that's interesting, even though with renewables you're generating electricity twice, create the electricity with the renewables, electrolyze the water, store the hydrogen, then put it in the fuel cell, you're doing it locally. So you don't have all the cost of transmission. Secondly, fuel cells are so much more efficient than any engine we have used in the fossil fuel age. Your efficiency can reach up to 90% or more. It's incredible. And all the heat you generate can go back to be used for power. So when we put it together, I think that I have no doubt the cost will get down to the point where we will be able to extract hydrogen and it'll almost be too cheap. The real cost is going to be the infrastructure to move it, the maintaining the grids, decentralize the power structure. But extracting the energy, I think the cost will get down there so it's absolutely manageable in the next 20 or 30 years. We're just beginning. Speak up if you could.
Another question. Do you feel a switch to a hydrogen economy is inevitable, for instance, over the coming century as fossil fuels are depleted? What about a switch to, for instance, a nuclear economy?
Let me give you my read on nuclear. First of all, I think it's an absolutely prime example of the kind of top-down command and control mechanisms that we used that had such a terrible, terrible consequence for society and the planet we live in. If ever I saw a form of power that I think is out of scale and not commensurate with its environment, it's nuclear power. We can't get rid of the waste. We don't know how to get rid of the waste. For 50 years, the scientists have said, we'll figure out how to decommission the waste. They can't do it. Now they have a second problem. It's called security in an era of terrorism. I just finished a editorial for the French papers. It's good for next week, and I've talked about nuclear power. You go over France in an airplane, and it's interesting. The French people think we're secure. We don't have to rely on fossil fuels. We have our independence. This is what President de Gaulle promised them with nuclear power. When I fly over France, my wife and I fly over there a lot, we say, oh my God, this is a tragedy waiting to happen. And I work with some of the major power and utility companies in the world, trying to move them out of nuclear and other things. And I've asked them, how do you prevent an attack? There isn't any way. It isn't the cooling towers that they're worried about. It's the spent nuclear rods in these little teeny sheds you can buy almost from Walmart. There are rods, spent nuclear rods in all these nuclear power plants. How do you prevent terrorism? Third, and this is the reason it's not going to happen, I can tell you that the utility companies I work with, there is no thought on any horizon of ever building another nuclear power plant. Nuclear power plant was a luxury because you had government control and regulation, and when utilities were monopolies, you could have these big subsidies to underwrite nuclear power. Deregulation is what killed nuclear power. Be clear. Ronald Reagan did a lot to end nuclear power. By deregulating the power industry, now power companies, they don't have liquidity. That's why they're building gas plants, because they're cheap. That's why they're going to go to distributed generation and say, well, forget the gas plants. We'll now put a fuel cell at the end line because that's even cheaper. Have you looked at the stock of utility companies lately? The big hit with the stock market burst was the telecom companies and the power and utility companies. They had very little liquidity before this stock market went down. Now they have no liquidity. There is not a power company in the world that has a design that I know of to build nuclear power plants. They're going to use the existing ones, then decommission them. Nuclear power is not a starter. Last word?
All right. what should we do politically in addition to those other types of organizing that you mentioned? Since other than California, as you mentioned, it seems our central government is desperately pursuing the oil and the military and where the reserves are and all that policy.
It's interesting you say this, because if you really step back and look at it anthropologically, what's happening, it's really clear, this divergence. You see the European Union muddling its way toward renewable energy with a hydrogen infrastructure. Then you see the U.S. government desperate to hold on to the old fossil fuel regime and oil. The desperation, we can feel it in this city of Washington. Get that oil up in Anwar, up in Alaska. And at the best possible scenario, it's an additional 1% of oil supply for the world. Go into Iraq and liberate the oil fields. My God, what are we thinking about? And now President Bush is working an arrangement with Mr. Putin in Russia, and they're going to have a big conference in Houston on October 1st to bring together the Russian oil companies and the American companies so that we can get oil from Siberia. Desperation. So I think while Europe seems to be muddling toward a new future beyond fossil fuels, we seem to be locked into the past. That's why I say that if we don't open up a new chapter, we could be a second-rate power by 2025 or 2030. That wasn't a throwaway line for your entertainment. I believe that could happen. So what do we do politically? The state of California pushed from the bottom up to get this legislation passed. This didn't start with a governor top-down. The environmental community, the local communities, the green communities, the social justice communities, they fought for this legislation for zero emission, near zero emission in cars. Now California, I believe, has signed a second bill that a large percentage of the energy within 8 years from now, a large percentage of the energy within 18 years from now has to be renewable. What if New York and Ohio and Florida and every other country had a grassroots movement to pass similar legislation that you can't come into our state and sell a car in 2009 unless you have near zero emission, and we're going to legislate so that 20% of all the energy we generate in this state by 2010 or 2015 is renewable. That's a revolution. And then if we can make sure that the local communities have access to the power grid so we can sell our energy back to each other, that's a revolution. So my suggestion is this. We spend far too much time, and I want to be in deference here, but we spend far too much time on who the candidates are going to be. Who's going to run for president? Do we have somebody that represents our point of view? We should be spending a lot more time politically in the communities organizing this kind of legislation with state reps and state senators and local community officials. So then we've got them. These companies are moving to hydrogen cars because they don't have a choice now, unless that legislation, evaporates. And if we can do the same thing on mandating renewable energy in each state, we got the beginning of a social movement. So my suggestion is spread the word. We have to have a better story, and I'll end with this. It's not enough to just be against something. We got a lot of activists here tonight. We do a pretty good job of what we're against, and sometimes you have to say what you're against before you can get to what you're for, because there's a lot of inequity out there. And sometimes we have to speak up and point to it so the attention of the world is on it. But now, all of us activists across the political spectrum, regardless of your affiliations, we got to have a better story now. We got to create a roadmap for the future so that our children have hope that there'll be a legacy worthy of the next generation. So, yes, let's have our struggles, but let's put them in a new frame. The frame is, let's move from fossil fuels to hydrogen. Now, let me be clear. Parallel tracks. Track one, we have to have tough CAFE standards, tough efficiency standards for fossil fuels, tough standards for conservation, because we're not going to end fossil fuels even by the mid parts of the 21st century. Tough. Point two, let's do the best we can to move from natural gas into hydrogen and subsidize and underwrite renewable resources. That way, if we begin this job, I would say by 2025, we'll have an infrastructure for transport and stationary and power and utility with hydrogen. I think by 2050, hydrogen could subsume fossil fuels as the primary power source in this country. Fossil fuels will still be in the mix. And I believe by the end of this century, Fossil fuels could be a boutique fuel source for special items like plastics and building materials and pharmacological products. So I think the test is right now for this generation. Create the roadmap. Let's have a better story. Let's get out there in our communities and begin to spread the word. And let's make sure that our commitment is here not just for tomorrow or next year, but for the next 50 years. Thank you. Good night.
Fabulous. Really great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. I'm really happy that you came tonight because you heard something that was very, very important and special. If you could give us a hand in folding up the chairs, and Jeremy will be available to talk to you and to sign books. We'll move the table out, and if you could start with the behind the man with the blue checked shirt.
Jeremy Rifkin is president of the Foundation on Economic Trends. His books include The End of Work, The Age of Access, and his latest, The Hydrogen Economy, published by Jeremy P. Tarcher. And
global warming has been an abstract issue, a policy issue. It became real this year. I just came back from Europe, where the talk throughout Europe are the floods. Germany, Central Europe, devastating some of our great historic cities. Here in the United States, people became worried for the first time this year with drought. We have record drought. And then we watched TV every night and we saw those forests burning across the entire western range. And now in Southeast Asia, they're following this brown cloud as it moves its way across the continent. 90,000 people dead already from respiratory diseases. They're expecting a 10% drop in yield of agricultural crops and maybe another 200,000 deaths as a result of this cloud. The scientists, they predicted this in the global warming models. They said, look, we're going to have more violent weather patterns, more floods, more drought, more wildfires. We're going to see the ice melt on the poles. We're seeing that. We're going to see water rising. It's happening. They said we're going to see pathogens crossing species boundaries and creating health impacts and health effects. We're seeing all of that. The current models predict that we're going to see something like a 2.5 to 10 degree Fahrenheit change in our temperature over the coming century. If it's the upper range, that is really serious because, as you know, between the last ice age and today, we had only a 9 degree Fahrenheit change. So what are the implications for ecosystems trying to adjust in less than 100 years to a climate change that usually takes 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 10,000 years to really have an impact? In some ways, I think global warming is the dark side of the industrial ledger. We're paying now in this way, we're paying the price, but if future generations look back at this time in history, they're likely to say the only thing they remember about us is the trace in the geological record. If you measure human accomplishments to date in terms of sheer impact, sheer power, you'd actually have to say that global warming is our greatest single accomplishment in terms of sheer impact, even though it's a negative one. We've actually affected the biochemistry of a planet, and we did it in less than a century. Global warming, the oil connection. The second great, I went back and forth with the Cassandras and the optimists. I talked to them all, and I really didn't know who was right. And then it dawned on me one day, what are we talking about? The difference between the Cassandras and the optimists on when oil is going to peak is 20 to 25 years. In the big sweep of geological history, it's irrelevant. Even in the sweep of human history, it's just a moment. So regardless of which side is right, we're entering the sunset years of the fossil fuel era. And what they both agree on, both sides, after we reach global peak on oil production, half the reserves used. Where are the rest of the reserves? 2/3 of them are in the Middle East and in the stands, the two most politically volatile parts of the world. If we think there's a desperation to get oil now, imagine in 5, 6, 10 years from now when China and India, which is 1/3 of the human race, they're going to want more and more oil for their countries too. Everyone's going to be positioned and focused to the Middle East. We're entering the sunset years of a unique moment in history, which began in the coal fields in England, and is now winding its way down in the oil fields of the Middle East. The era of fossil fuels, the era of the Industrial Revolution, the era of urbanization, the era of the nation state, the era of the bourgeois family, the era of constitutional rights. All of that came side by side with the fossil fuel energy regime. There's only been about 25 or 30 great civilizations in history. Historians disagree as to exactly how many. There are a lot of reasons why great civilizations collapse. But one of the overriding reasons we see over and over is when a civilization depletes its energy regime, its infrastructure is so locked in, it cannot make the transformation into a new energy regime in time. I was just in Rome last week, and it reminded me. Because, of course, Imperial Rome relied heavily on the soil for its energy regime. It kept taxing the soil and taxing the soil to get more and more food out, surplus, so that they could provide not only for the million slaves in Rome, but for the aristocracy and the non-producing class. By the 3rd or 4th century, all the lands around Rome and the Mediterranean, there's a sub-theme moving through this town in all the policy circles. Everyone's aware of it. Mr. Bush is an oil man. Mr. Cheney is an oil man. They cannot be unmindful of the following fact. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the entire world after Saudi Arabia. So a secondary impact of invading that country, we, quote, liberate the oil fields, unquote. And then the United States has a new strategic balance of power in the Middle East with the Saudis and with the whole world. Unless we wonder how the United States is going to get the votes in the Security Council, France is going to want, the French companies, oil companies are going to want concessions. The Russian oil companies are going to want concessions. The Italian oil companies are going to want concessions. After we're in there, they're all going to want a part of the action with the future of oil. You don't think they're going to vote with us? Because our military will be there and we will have the position of strength to determine who gets the oil concessions and who doesn't. Global warming, the great divide between the haves and have-nots, more and more debt in the third world, increasing geopolitical tension in the Middle East. Now, the greatest nation in the world invading a country to liberate the oil. If this were all we were contending with, it would be enough for this generation. But now we have something else. The conventional wisdom was that we had about 40 years or so of cheap crude oil left until we reach peak. Now let me explain peak. It's a geological term. Peak is when half your global reserves of oil are used up. Now that doesn't sound bad, just half, but half is the critical point, not when you run out of oil. When you reach peak on that bell curve and half of your reserves are used up, then your prices never go down. Your prices continue to go up, up, up. Well, in the last couple of years, there's been an interesting debate unfolding in the scientific community, not on the public radar screen at all, but about a dozen world-class geologists, some of the best that we have been going back and looking at the numbers again. And now they're saying, well, maybe we got it wrong. The new computer models suggest that global oil could peak in production by the end of this decade, or no later than 2020. For months,
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and I want to welcome you here tonight. It always gives me pleasure to have Jeremy Rifkin here. We've known each other for 25 years, and I've watched Jeremy's wonderful studies in a variety of different fields. It's hard for me to even say what my favorite topic is because there have been so many, and he's produced such a wealth of wise books. I think The End of Work might be one of my favorites, at least until now. I think the issue of shifting our economy from petroleum-based to other forms of energy is so incredibly important that I'm really glad that Jeremy Rifkin is working on this issue, because anything that Jeremy puts his mind to, he can make it a salient issue nationally. So here's Jeremy.
Good evening, everybody. There are three great crises facing the human family today. Each one of them is historic in nature. Together, they pose one of the great challenges for society as we try to make the bridge into this 21st century. Every single one of these issues is connected to oil. The first, of course, is global warming. The oil connection is obvious. We spent the last 300 years burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Tremendous benefits for at least part of human civilization in the industrialized countries of the North and the West. Now we're paying the bill. All of that spent energy, that carbon dioxide, is now up in the atmosphere, blocking heat from getting off of this planet. Now, I must say, I first wrote about global warming in 1980 in a book called Entropy. But in the last 22 years, this question of crisis facing the human family, the North-South divide, the haves, the have-nots. Never before in history have so few human beings enjoyed so much of the largesse of this planet, and so many been denied even basic access to water, land, and food. We don't have anything in the anthropological record, anything like this divide. What we forget is that much of the reason for the problem is directly connected to oil. When OPEC placed that oil embargo in the 1970s, oil shot up by 4 times in less than 4 months. The oil prices never came down. So for 30 years, developing countries, third world countries, have been going to world lending institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, desperate for loans so they could pay for oil. They've never been able to catch up to the price of the oil. So today, 83 cents out of every dollar that's borrowed from world lending institutions by third world countries is being used to pay back the old loans. So almost no oil is getting through the pipeline to the people. The statistic that always I keep in mind is this. The 356 wealthiest human beings in the world today, you could put them in this room. Their combined wealth equals the annual income of 40% of humanity. What more do we need to say? So, global warming, the oil connection. The North-South divide, the haves, the have-nots, more and more debt, the oil connection. The third crisis is one that's very immediate in all of our minds right now, and that's the Middle East and the increasing geopolitical tension there. Remember, Osama bin Laden first took out his ire against the West when we positioned our military aircraft on Saudi soil in concert with the royal family. He vowed a jihad. He said we are desecrating the Holy Land. He delivered on 9/11 with the World Trade Center attack and the attack on the Pentagon. Now President Bush is determined to invade Iraq. The ostensible reason, Saddam Hussein may have a weapon of mass destruction, or at least he would like to have a weapon of mass destruction. I have to tell you, I take President Bush at his word. I think that is his primary motivation. But look, I've lived in this town, Washington, for 30 years.